The forge burned with a dull red fury. Heat shimmered against the dirt floor, wrapping the small workshop in a haze of smoke and breathless air. Elias stood alone, a tall figure carved in sweat and shadow. The light from the furnace cut across his face, tracing the lines time had carved there. His hands moved slowly but with precision. He lifted the hammer, brought it down, and shaped the metal with the calm patience of a man who had nothing left to lose. Ash clung to his shoulders. His chest rose and fell, each breath heavy, measured, filled with an old fire that never went out. Around him hung chains, locks, broken tools, ghosts of his own creation. They swayed slightly in the heat, whispering of years spent in servitude. The smell of burning coal mixed with iron filled the air. It was a scent he had known since childhood, the smell of obedience. He had learned the trade from a white overseer who called him boy, even when his hair had begun to gray. Every piece of iron he had ever made had gone to someone else's comfort, someone else's control. He had built doors he could never open, tools he could never own, and gates that locked him away from the world beyond the fields. In one corner, on a wooden table, rested a half-finished chain, thick, heavy, still glowing faintly from the forge. Elias stared at it for a long time. The reflection of the fire trembled in his eyes. He reached out, his fingers tracing the metal's rough edge. He knew its shape too well. It was the shape of memory. 2 decades had passed since the day he forged his first shackle. That same night they had placed it around his own ankles. He could still feel the cold bite of the metal in his skin, still hear the soft laughter of the man who locked it there. That man had grown old now, the plantation's master, Elias's master, the one who once said, "A good slave dies in the same place he's born." Elias had never answered then, but inside, something had begun to burn. He learned to feed that fire quietly with silence, obedience, patience. Now, as the world outside began to crumble in the whispers of war, the fire inside him was ready to breathe. He turned from the table and stepped toward the furnace. The light bathed him in crimson glow, outlining his scars, his strength, his stillness. A faint tremor passed through his hands as he lifted a new piece of iron from the fire. Its shape was long, curved, deliberate. He placed it on the anvil, eyes focused, movements slow, careful. This was no hinge, no lock, no shackle. The piece began to take form, a box of sorts, a structure with purpose and weight. He didn't think of what it was becoming. He already knew. He worked through the night, sweat turning to steam, the air thick and alive with heat. In his mind, memories returned, faces of the men who had whipped him, the women who cried behind the quarters, the screams that never left the soil. Every strike he made carried one of their names. When he paused, he wiped his brow with the back of his arm. The skin was cracked, burned, but steady. He looked toward the small window. Outside, the sky had turned pale. Dawn was coming, slow and heavy over the Alabama fields. The cotton shimmered under the first light, soft and white, like a false peace. He could see the big house far in the distance, tall columns, painted walls, all built from blood. Smoke rose gently from its chimney. The world seemed still, but he knew that stillness had teeth. He returned to his work, his breath steady. The iron cooled and darkened under his touch. He lifted another piece, shaped it, measured it, placed it beside the first. The outline grew longer, more defined. For the first time in years, Elias felt a strange calm, not peace, not joy, but the deep silence that comes when purpose finds its place. He stopped and stared at what he had made so far. His eyes softened, almost tender. He whispered under his breath, not in prayer, but in remembrance. The words were lost in the smoke, but his expression carried their meaning. This is not for him, it's for me. He stepped back, studying the frame, the weight, the symmetry. The iron reflected his face, not the slave's face they had known, but the man beneath it. The fire behind him dimmed slightly. The workshop fell into half-darkness. He set the hammer down on the table and wiped his hands on his apron. The night's labor had left his arms trembling, but his eyes were still alive with that silent fire. He looked once more at the iron box, at the shape that now seemed to breathe with its own life. The light from the dying furnace flickered across it, and for a brief moment the form cast a shadow that looked almost like a coffin. Elias stood motionless, the truth of it reflected in his eyes. A slow exhale left his chest, carrying 20 years of silence into the smoke. Outside, a rooster crowed faintly in the distance. The world would wake soon. The fields would fill again with footsteps, voices, orders. But inside the forge, something else had awakened, something colder, older, and stronger than obedience. Elias turned toward the door, his expression unreadable, his hands still streaked with soot and purpose. Behind him, the iron lay waiting, dark, unfinished, patient. The first piece of his master's coffin. The forest at the edge of the plantation was thick, tangled, and unforgiving. Elias moved through it with a quiet purpose, each step measured, careful. Dawn had left the sky pale and heavy, streaked with clouds that promised rain. The ground was soft beneath his feet, damp with fallen leaves and the remnants of last night's storm. He paused at the edge of a small creek, water moving sluggishly, reflecting his own weary face. The reflection was dark and distorted, twisted by the ripples. He knelt and let his fingers trail through the cold water. It was pure, untouched, a reminder that the world beyond chains could exist. Yet he did not drink, he could not forget the past, nor could he yet embrace freedom. The hammer rested against his shoulder, heavy, comforting. It was more than a tool. It was a promise, a memory, and a weapon in waiting. Every notch in its handle carried the weight of his history. Every scratch in its face spoke of labor, pain, and survival. He remembered the first time he lifted it alone. The fire of the forge had been hot enough to burn through his courage. The overseer had laughed, saying, "You'll break before the metal does." But the metal had not broken, and neither had he. He continued through the woods, shadows stretching like long fingers between the trees. Birds took flight at his passing, startled, scattering into the cold air. Branches snapped softly underfoot. His mind wandered to the plantation house, standing tall in the distance. White pillars gleaming, walls immaculate, built on blood and obedience. He had walked past it countless times, carrying tools, carrying chains, carrying memories. Tonight that house would be different. He had carried the seed of his plan for years, hidden in the rhythm of the hammer, in the patience of the forge. The creek widened, forming a pool deep and dark. Elias crouched beside it, letting the cool water wash his hands, hands that had built, bound, and burned, hands that would now create something final. He thought of the overseer, of the cruel men who had ruled the fields, of the master who had never looked him in the eye except to assert ownership, and of the people he had lost, whose names whispered in the night. Each step forward through the forest brought him closer to the place where vengeance would take form. The hammer was heavier now, though his grip never faltered. He remembered forging the first shackle for a man who had cried silently under the whip. He remembered forging gates that barred his own family from safety. He remembered the fire that had warmed no one, the smoke that had stung every eye but his own. All of it had taught him patience. He had waited for the moment when the hammer would serve a different purpose, a purpose he had carried in silence for decades. The path narrowed, framed by tall oaks that seemed to watch him pass. The forest felt alive, aware. A hawk circled overhead, black against the gray sky. Elias moved steadily, eyes scanning every shadow, every curve of the land. He could hear the plantation in the distance, men moving, horses neighing, doors opening. He did not quicken his pace. Speed would ruin the plan. Each breath was controlled, each movement deliberate. He reached a clearing where the soil had been churned by animals and rain. This place would serve as the next stage of his work. He knelt, feeling the earth, smelling the damp moss and broken leaves. The soil was loose, ready to receive the final form of years of rage. He set the hammer down briefly, letting his hands rest on the earth. In the shadow of the trees, he closed his eyes. He imagined the master sleeping, dreaming of wealth and obedience, untouched by consequence. Elias's jaw tightened. He opened his eyes and lifted the hammer once more. It felt natural, as if the tool had grown from his own bones. He began to measure the earth, imagining the shape he would carve. The weight of years pressed against his shoulders, steady, patient, demanding. Each movement, each glance around the clearing was careful. Every decision carried the echoes of past pain. He thought of the forge, of molten metal, of sparks that had never left his skin. He thought of the chains he had made, the doors he had closed, the lives he had built for others. And he thought of the one thing he would now build for himself. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Leaves hung frozen in the air, and even the wind felt subdued. Elias worked quietly, moving through the motions he had practiced 1,000 times in his mind. Every action was deliberate, precise. The sun climbed higher, spilling pale light into the clearing, but he did not pause. Hours passed. His body grew tired, but his hands never faltered. By midday, the first frame of the final work took shape in his mind. A simple outline at first, a promise in shadow, waiting for its completion. He paused, looking around at the forest, at the creek, at the path he had taken. The world had shifted beneath his feet without anyone noticing, and he had shifted with it, silent, invisible, unstoppable. He gathered the earth, smoothing and shaping, preparing for the work that would come. The hammer rested beside him, waiting for the moment it would serve its new purpose. Elias closed his eyes again, breathing in the forest, the iron, and the weight of what was to come. He was ready, and the forest seemed to lean in, bearing witness to the patience of vengeance and the birth of a reckoning. The forge waited, silent now, its fire reduced to glowing embers. Elias entered, the door swinging shut behind him, sealing the night into the walls. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and the scent of iron. The hammer lay on the table, worn, familiar, a weight that felt like a part of his own arm. He ran his hands over the anvil, tracing the marks of old labor, scars shaped by decades of obedience. The furnace loomed behind him, silent and patient, as if aware that it would be needed again. He knelt, examining the half-finished pieces he had left earlier. Each one held the memory of chains, locks, and shackles. Each one reminded him of the men who had slept comfortably while others suffered. Elias's eyes narrowed as he picked up a glowing piece of iron from the embers. He rotated it slowly, studying its curves, its strength, its readiness. The forge seemed to breathe around him, the heat rising in slow, deliberate waves. He placed the iron onto the anvil and began shaping it with careful, precise movements. Time passed unnoticed, measured only by the slow collapse of embers and the bending of metal. The shadows of the room shifted as the firelight danced across the walls. Elias's face was carved from focus, his muscles coiled with intention. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and stared into the glowing metal. Memories flooded back, the cruel laughter of masters, the sting of whips, the faces of those he could never save. He gripped the hammer again and worked, each strike deliberate, building toward a vision that had lived in his mind for years. The metal bent under his hands, yielding, reshaping itself according to the quiet command of decades of hidden fury. He could feel the shape emerging, dark, solid, uncompromising. It was more than a tool now. It was an instrument of reckoning. The room seemed smaller as he worked, walls closing in, holding him and his purpose together. Outside, the night deepened, the plantation silent except for distant shouts and the restless stir of animals. He paused to examine the frame, running fingers along its edges, feeling the weight of inevitability. His hands trembled slightly, not from fatigue, but from the anticipation of what was to come. He remembered the first hammer he had lifted, the first chain he had forged, the first shackle he had worn. All of it had led to this moment, quiet and patient, beneath the furnace he had once feared. The iron cooled slightly, but its promise remained hot, burning in the space between his thoughts. He lifted another piece, shaped it, and connected it with the frame he had built. The structure grew, deliberate, precise, inevitable. Elias stepped back, his eyes tracing every line, every curve, every edge. He imagined the master walking into the forge unaware, confident, untouchable. He imagined that same man meeting the cold finality of what had been forged. No words could express the patience, the planning, the quiet fury that had gone into these pieces. The room was silent, save for the occasional settling of dust and metal. Elias knelt beside the structure, tracing the shape with both hands. It was nearing completion, each segment falling into place like memory into history. He straightened, wiping ash from his arms, his eyes never leaving the work. The furnace behind him glowed faintly, casting long shadows across the walls. In that dim light, the frame seemed almost alive, breathing slowly, waiting. He moved to the corner, gathering tools, measuring, adjusting. The sweat on his skin had cooled, but his resolve burned brighter than ever. Each movement was precise, practiced, controlled. He remembered the night sky above the fields, the distant stars, the lives buried under the weight of obedience. He set the last piece into place, the final segment fitting seamlessly into the whole. The structure now stood before him, complete and silent, powerful in its simplicity. Elias stepped back, letting his gaze sweep over the forge, the furnace, and the fruits of decades of patience. The air was heavy with the smell of iron and ash, the quiet aftermath of creation. He ran a hand along the frame, feeling the cold, solid truth of it. This was no longer a piece of metal. This was history, memory, and promise forged into shape. Outside, the night whispered. The plantation breathed, oblivious to what had been born beneath the furnace. Elias lowered the hammer and closed his eyes. The weight of years pressed on him, and yet he felt lighter, freer, complete in a way he had never known. The first stage of reckoning was done. The next would follow, quiet, patient, inevitable, and beneath the furnace, in the glow of embers and memory, the frame waited dark, solid, unyielding, like the man who had forged it. The morning mist lay thick over the fields, softening the edges of the plantation. Elias moved through it, silent, almost invisible, as though the fog carried him. The earth beneath his feet was damp, the scent of wet soil and cotton heavy in the air. He paused at the edge of a burned-out fence, staring at the blackened wood. Years ago, that fence had held him and his people in. Now it was nothing more than ash and memory. He knelt, letting his fingers brush over the charred remains. The smell of smoke clung to his hands, a reminder of things destroyed long ago. His eyes swept across the fields. They seemed empty, but he knew they were filled with stories. Stories of labor, fear, and the quiet suffering of those who had no voice. Elias walked toward the quarters, the small cabins that had housed the enslaved. Most were abandoned now, doors hanging loose, roofs sagging, windows broken. Inside he found remnants of life, a scorched table, a rusted pot, a cracked dish. He touched them lightly, as though feeling the memories trapped in the object's every scratch. In the wood told a story of survival. Every dent in the metal spoke of defiance. He walked outside again, letting the wind carry the memories across his face. The plantation house stood distant, white, proud, and ignorant of the past buried beneath it. He had spent years shaping iron, building gates and chains, and yet he had never built anything for himself. Today, the work beneath the furnace had changed that. Elias approached a clearing where the ground had been dug, reshaped, waiting for the next stage. He knelt and let his hands sift through the soil. It was loose and dark, full of possibility and memory. He imagined the master walking across these fields, confident and blind to the weight of history. The thought did not make him smile. It made him steady. His eyes moved to a small tree near the clearing, its branches bare, its roots exposed. He remembered tying the first chains to a similar tree, feeling their cold weight and sharp bite. Now he traced the roots slightly with his fingers, thinking of how they had held up the world above. Above, everything seemed peaceful. Below, everything was remembered. The sun rose higher, spilling light that caught on drops of dew, making them glitter like forgotten tears. Elias stayed low, moving methodically, thinking carefully about every step. He remembered the faces of men who had laughed at his labor. He remembered the cries of women whose hands had known only work and sorrow. He remembered himself, small, young, and burning with a silent fire that never left. He knelt and began marking the ground with small stakes, outlining shapes that would one day hold truth and consequence. His hands were steady, his breath measured. Each motion was a continuation of decades of patience, careful and deliberate. The air around him seemed still, as though watching. He reached for a small metal tool, pressing it into the soil, feeling the resistance and the give beneath his fingers. Every inch of earth told him its secrets, where roots had grown, where water had pooled, where shadows had slept. He worked slowly, deliberately, marking spaces that would one day contain metal, fire, and finality. The hammer leaned against a tree nearby, silent, patient like him. He paused, looking over the clearing, letting the wind carry the smells and sounds of the plantation toward him. Everything felt distant and yet intensely present. He thought of the master, of the overseers, of the blind confidence they carried. He imagined the day they would understand the weight of what had been built in secrecy. The thought made him tighten his jaw. He continued marking, measuring, shaping, every movement precise, every action meaningful. The soil beneath his hands felt alive with memory, ready to hold what was coming. A crow flew overhead, black against the pale sky, its wings slicing through the light. Elias's eyes followed it, letting it pass, unmoved. Hours passed in quiet work, his body moving with the rhythm of decades of experience. Each mark, each measurement, each careful motion was a story of survival and deferred justice. He looked back at the plantation house. Its white walls seemed thinner now, its shadow less confident. The past had weight, the past had patience. He pressed the last stake into the earth, stepping back to survey the work. The clearing now held the shape of the plan, dark and deliberate, waiting for the metal that would soon follow. He knelt one last time, touching the soil, feeling its cool resistance against his palms. For a moment he allowed himself to feel the enormity of the years he had waited, the silence he had kept, the patience he had honed. The sun climbed, the air shifted, and the clearing seemed to breathe with him. Everything was in place. The stage was ready, and beneath the ashes of the past, in the quiet, dark soil, the promise of vengeance waited. Elias stood slowly, stretching, his eyes fixed on the distant house, the fields, the horizon. He touched the hammer, feeling its weight, its familiarity, its purpose. Today was a beginning. The work beneath the furnace had been the first step, and the past, patient and relentless, would guide every next step to come. The forge sat silent, its embers dim but not dead. Elias entered, his silhouette cutting through the haze of early morning. The walls were blackened from years of fire and labor. Tools hung in order, each one a remnant of a life spent bending metal and will. He approached the anvil, fingers tracing the scars etched into its surface. Every groove, every dent told a story of endurance and patience. The hammer rested nearby, heavy and familiar, as if waiting for his command. He knelt, feeling the weight of history pressing on his shoulders. The iron lay before him, glowing faintly from residual heat. Its shape was deliberate, crafted from memory and intention. He picked up a chisel, feeling its cold metal against his calloused fingers. The piece had begun to take form, not as a tool, not as a chain, but as something final. Elias worked methodically, shaping, bending, coaxing the iron into its destined shape. Each movement was precise, measured, deliberate. Years of patience guided his hands, decades of silence informed his choices. He paused, stepping back to survey the structure. Its lines were clean, unyielding, powerful in their simplicity. He imagined the master walking through the plantation, unaware of what was coming. He imagined the men who had laughed at him, blind to the skill and fire contained within the forge. The image steeled his resolve, focused his intent. He lifted the hammer again, placing it carefully in position. The iron responded, bending and holding, shaping itself into a frame of inevitability. Elias traced his hands over the edges, feeling the cold hardness, the weight of consequence. Outside, the sun climbed slowly, pale light filtering through cracks in the walls. Shadows stretched long across the floor, echoing the shape of what was to come. He worked without pause, letting the rhythm of creation guide him. Each segment of iron fit seamlessly into the next, forming a whole stronger than any chain he had ever forged. Memories of pain and labor coalesced in his mind, feeding the precision of his hands. He remembered the first shackle he had ever held, the first chain he had worn, the first time the whip had cracked across flesh. All of it had led him here, to this room, this forge, this moment. He moved with the certainty of a man who had nothing left to lose. The metal took shape slowly, deliberate, unyielding. He examined it carefully, ensuring that each angle, each curve, each edge was perfect. The structure now stood as a testament to patience, endurance, and quiet vengeance. Elias stepped back, wiping ash and sweat from his arms. He surveyed the forge, the anvil, the iron, the culmination of years of hidden intent. The room seemed to breathe around him, alive with anticipation, heavy with promise. He knelt once more, pressing his palms to the floor, grounding himself in the reality of what had been built. The air smelled of iron and fire, of smoke and memory. He straightened, eyes fixed on the distant plantation, the house where commands had been given, lives broken, and futures stolen. His shadow fell long across the floor, merging with the shape he had created. Elias lifted the hammer again, holding it lightly, feeling the balance and weight, feeling the years it carried. Every strike now would be deliberate, precise, and final. The structure before him seemed to wait, patient, silent, inevitable. He imagined it completed, standing in the light, holding the promise of consequence. The forge around him felt smaller, intimate, a sacred space for what was to come. He touched the iron once more, letting his fingers trace the final lines, the edges cold but unyielding. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet earth and distant smoke. Elias inhaled deeply, letting the air fill him, steady him, prepare him. Everything was ready, every detail considered, every motion planned. The next phase of fate would begin soon, shaped by the hands of a man who had learned patience and endured injustice. The hammer rested beside him, quiet, waiting, ready. And Elias knew, as he stood in the dim glow of the forge, that nothing would ever be the same again. The fire in his soul burned steady, controlled, unbroken. The shaping of fate was complete in its first stage. The world outside remained unaware, fragile in its ignorance. But inside the forge, history had already turned, silent, deliberate, and relentless. Elias looked around one last time, letting the enormity of the work sink in. The metal lay in form, patient, ready, alive in purpose. He breathed slowly, deeply, and let his vision of justice solidify in the quiet heat of the forge. He was no longer just a blacksmith. He was a force, a presence, a reckoning waiting to step out into the world. And beneath the furnace, the iron waited, dark, unyielding, and inevitable. Night presses against the walls of the forge. The fire burns low, breathing like a tired beast. Jonah stands before it, his face half shadow, half glow, the hammer in his hand trembling with quiet purpose. Every stroke from his arm lands heavier now. The air smells of burnt metal and old ghosts. Sparks rise like tiny spirits, whispering of names forgotten beneath red clay. He listens to them as if they're his kin. He's not forging iron anymore. He's forging memory. Every hiss, every bend of metal, carries the echo of chains broken long ago. Outside, the rain starts, soft at first, like the earth morning. Inside, the forge answers with heat stubborn, angry, alive. The same furnace where his master's tools once hissed now bends to his will. He stares into the flames. Sometimes he sees faces. They're not demons, not ghosts, but reflections. The men who were whipped beside him, the woman who sang even when the lash fell, the boy who didn't wake up after sunrise. The hammer falls again. Each strike is a heartbeat, each heartbeat is defiance. He knows the dawn will bring the funeral. They'll lower the coffin. He made the coffin of his master. The same coffin that bears the weight of years of pain hammered into every nail. He touches the iron lid, still warm, still alive, almost. The villagers say he's cursed, that he talks to the dead metal, that his fire burns longer than any man's should. But they don't understand. This isn't curse. This is remembrance made solid. He whispers, he'll sleep in what he gave me. And the forge flickers, as if agreeing. The room feels smaller now, walls closing in, ghosts standing shoulder to shoulder. He's not afraid. He's never been afraid of the dead, only of forgetting them. A small ember pops and lands on his arm. He doesn't flinch. Pain is nothing new. Pain is the only thing that ever spoke truth. His reflection in the iron glows faintly red. For a moment it looks like the master's face, smirking, unbroken, eternal. Jonah leans closer, and the reflection changes, becomes his own again, scarred and calm. He lifts the hammer one last time, brings it down slow. A single echo fills the forge, low and deep. Outside, thunder cracks, rain hits the roof like fists. Somewhere a dog howls at the scent of fire and death. Jonah wipes his face with the back of his arm. Soot and sweat smear together. He doesn't blink. He just breathes heavy, raw, alive. The forge hisses, the last breath of flame curling up like smoke from a grave. He takes off his apron, lays it over the coffin, a shroud of labor. He whispers to the iron again, now you know. It almost sounds like the metal sighs back. In that silence he feels the shift, the balance returning. Not peace, never peace, but balance. The kind a man finds when the world has taken everything and he still stands. The door creaks open. The night air spills in, cold and damp. He steps out into the rain, the forge's glow dying behind him. Each drop that hits his skin feels like cooling steel, cleansing, not forgiving. Tomorrow the coffin will be lowered. Tomorrow the whispers will start again. But tonight the fire rests, and so does he. Jonah looks once more toward the blacksmith's hut, the smoke still curling toward the clouds. The same smoke that once carried screams now carries nothing but quiet. He smiles faintly, a tired, broken thing. Because some fires don't die when you put them out. They live in the bones of the man who lit them. The morning came gray and swollen with rain. The earth outside Jonah's forge was soft and black, as if it too had bled through the night. A small crowd gathered beneath umbrellas and hats, whispering between the cracks of thunder. The coffin lay still on the wagon, dark, iron-bound, heavier than any they'd ever seen. Jonah stood apart from them, the hammer hanging loose at his side. His eyes were rimmed with ash and sleeplessness, yet they held a strange calm. He had spent the night inside the forge, speaking to the iron until it stopped groaning. When the sun failed to rise properly, he took it as a sign the world itself reluctant to witness what came next. The preacher's voice carried over the wind, hollow and quick. No one cared for words today. They just wanted the ground to take what was left of the man who once owned half the county and every soul upon it. Jonah watched the preacher's lips move, but all he heard was the hiss of iron cooling. When the time came, 4 men stepped forward to lift the coffin. It barely budged. The chains that lined its edges rattled like a low growl. Jonah's eyes caught on one of them, a single rusted link from the shackles he'd once worn. He had melted it down, reforged it, and folded it into the lid's spine. His master would rest beneath the same weight he had forced others to carry. Rain began to fall harder, washing the red clay into streaks across the coffin's sides. The preacher raised his hand for the final blessing, but Jonah stepped forward before the words left his mouth. The crowd turned. His boots sank in the mud as he approached, each step measured, deliberate. He reached the coffin and set the hammer upon it. A murmur spread through the crowd. They'd seen him work with that hammer since boyhood. It was older than any man standing there. He ran his fingers along its head, tracing the groove where the metal had split years ago. He forged this with me, Jonah said quietly. Now it belongs to him. The silence that followed was alive. Even the rain seemed to pause. Jonah knelt, touched the coffin's cold edge, and whispered something. No one could hear. Then he stood, eyes fixed on the preacher. Close it, he said. Let him sleep. The preacher nodded, his voice trembling. May his soul, Jonah interrupted, his tone steady, almost kind. His soul already found its place. This is for the rest of him. The lid shut with a deep, hollow sound that rolled through the valley like thunder. Trapped in wood. Jonah turned away before the first handful of dirt struck the coffin. Each impact echoed against his spine, soft and final. As the crowd dispersed, he remained standing. The grave looked peaceful from a distance, but he knew what lay beneath iron walls, shackles reborn, a tomb forged by a man once bound by the same metal. He had not built a coffin, he had built a mirror. By noon, the rain cleared. The air shimmered with heat again, thick and heavy. Jonah walked back to the forge, his boots leaving deep prints in the wet soil. The world felt quieter now. Inside, the fire had died to embers, still glowing faintly, as if waiting for instruction. He hung the hammer above the door, the same place his master once hung his whip. The symmetry made him smile. It wasn't joy, not quite. It was something sharper, something earned. He poured water over the coals. Steam rose and filled the room with a sigh that sounded almost human. The forge went dark, leaving behind only the smell of soot and iron. Jonah stood there in the dimness, listening to the silence. For the first time, it didn't feel empty. He thought of the men still living in chains, of the women whispering songs to the night, of the children who didn't yet know the sound of freedom. His revenge wasn't theirs to carry, but maybe it lit a small fire in the dark. Maybe that was enough. The door creaked behind him. A young boy, the new apprentice, barely 12, peeked. In, sir? He said softly. Should I light the forge again? Jonah looked back at him, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth. No, he said. Let it rest today. The fire's done enough work. The boy nodded and stepped back into the sunlight. Jonah followed, letting the daylight wash over his face. The air smelled of wet earth and faint smoke. He raised his eyes to the hills beyond, their outlines silver under the breaking clouds. Somewhere out there, the echoes of chains still rattled, but in his forge in his small, quiet corner of Alabama the sound had stopped. He had taken the noise of suffering and beaten it into silence. As he walked toward the road, the wind shifted, carrying the faint metallic scent of rain and rust. It reminded him of the coffin. The weight of it, the truth sealed inside. He didn't need to look back. The fire would remember, the iron would remember, the land itself would remember, because in the end it wasn't about vengeance or forgiveness. It was about balance, and the blacksmith had finally forged his world into shape.